You've got this great original character that deserves their own grand adventure. Or maybe you've got a concept brewing in that brain of yours that you are sure would blow the minds of your readers. Or you could have an idea for a world you've built with a unique power system. You could just have an idea for a cool arc with an amazing twist. Maybe you have none of these things, but you want to write your own manga or comic. But how do you start? Well, Nibbling, that is exactly where I was a while back. And while I'm no professional with absolute knowledge of what makes $1 million franchise, I did get started, and I can share some of the do's and don'ts about getting started, the resources that helped me get from absolutely nothing to show to a completed chapter 1 and more chapters in the works. I'll go through each stage necessary to creating a strong comic, and then at the end, I'll go over some quick general tips that are helpful to keep in mind when creating comics. Chapter 1. Find your purpose. First things first, Nibbling. Why do you want to make a comic? Sequential art is both an incredibly rewarding art form, but also an incredibly complex one that requires a huge variety of skills and gives very little in return. If you think that sequential art will gain you notoriety, money, or fame, you might want to look for another path for your characters or story. The truth is that making comics by itself doesn't gain you a lot of money. The biggest ones out there do, but those are really outliers. And it might be better for you to help somebody else with their story, or maybe work for a studio if making enough money is going to be really important for you. Otherwise, you can continue with your own story here. Just know that money is not a guarantee here, and neither is fame. There are many reasons to make a comic that can really help you get into them and keep you creating for a long time. The main reason to do it is a love for the medium and a love for your story. If you have a genuine passion that burns in your heart, wait no longer. This is plenty to get started. Another great reason to get started, which motivated me when I was getting started with comics, was rather than wait to be good enough at writing, comics, art, storytelling, all of that stuff, is that you learn as you go. If you take the time you need to reference resources meant to guide you on your way, especially if you are stuck or struggling with certain panels or story details, you will find yourself gaining a huge wealth of knowledge rapidly, and it will apply to everything that you do later. You might find that the beginning of your story might be a little bit weaker than if you had already been good enough, but it is a really great way to start learning comics. It's important that you find your purpose for creating. Just make sure you aren't looking for fame or wealth, because you certainly won't find it here. Chapter 2. Find your story, characters, world, or concept. Now that we know our purpose, now we can get started on some of the fun stuff. What story do you want to tell? If you have an OC, a world, a story arc, or concept, you're already one step ahead. You need one of these things in order to get a comic going, so if you don't, find one. Take a look at your private drawings or writing and see what it is that you enjoy making the most. If you've got a character or scenery that you really love, ask yourself questions about it and write the answers down. What kinds of things does your character like or not like? What kind of job or hobbies might they have? What are their motivations? Who do they love? Where do they live? What kind of people live in the world you created? What are their struggles? What resources are plentiful and available to them? What might the political dynamic be in that world? If you have a concept or arc in mind instead, do the same thing. Just ask yourself slightly different questions, like who might find themselves in this situation? What kind of person is required to make the decisions needed to reach the end goal? My recommendation at this stage, especially if you are new to comics, is to try to keep the story short. One-shots are great practice for you to get the hang of the process. If you're looking to do something a bit longer, by all means, go for it, but know that consistency in your style might be an issue, especially at the beginning. I didn't start with a one-shot, and while that was helpful in some ways, I also felt the downsides of skipping that one-shot process. By asking yourself these questions and writing down the answers, you will begin to find the other pieces of your story. Repeat this process until you have a basic cast, a basic world for them to inhabit, and some kind of motivation for them to guide us in the story you want to tell. If you're still struggling with finding the answers to some of these questions, try thinking about what might stop your main character from achieving their goals. Every good story has some kind of conflict. Even slice of life stories have conflicts. They just may not be world ending. Your favorite stories from TV shows, manga, comics, anime, films, books, or real life might be inspiration for you to find this answer. There are many possible options like villains, society, nature, their inner self, and more. Look into the conflicts in literature to identify the many possible options. Just don't try to overthink it at this stage. We only need a general idea. We'll work out the dents later. Don't worry about being original, unique, complex, or nuanced. None of that stuff matters right now. Chapter 3. Flesh out your ideas. Now we've got the basic bones of our comic, and we can get a little deeper into the weeds. There is no set next step here, but what is vital is that you take another step. What I recommend to do is the thing that you feel the most comfortable doing. If you're an artist, start creating sketches of these characters and locations, just to get them down on paper. Don't try to make complete illustrations, just do enough that you know what they look like. If you're more of a writer, then write down the characteristics of your cast and descriptions of your locations, including what is in there, who goes to this location, and what typically happens there. Again, don't get too specific at this stage. It's very likely that you will change these things at some point later on, and all we need to do is get our ideas down on paper. You might also benefit from drawing a diagram of the parts of the story you do already know. How does your story start? How does it end? What starts the conflict? What needs to happen in order for us to get from point A to point B? Be general here. This is your compass, not your map. Once you've done one of these things, do the others that I've named. Start with one, then move on to the next. You might find that you'll be changing your mind as you go through these different stages, and that's okay. You're iterating, and iteration can only help you at the beginning. At this point, it's a good idea to start writing a basic outline. Use simple factual sentences like, John finds a magical sword in the woods outside that summons a dead army to attack his village in search of the sacred sword, instead of storytelling sentences like, one day John woke up in his home by the river. He decided he would go outside and explore today, yada yada yada. Just get the major story points written down so you can reference them later. We want to make sure what's in our minds makes sense when we write it down. You avoid major plot holes doing it this way. If you have a friend or family member that you trust with giving you feedback, this is a good thing to share with them and see what they think. If you have a good drawing that can help them visualize the story better, share that too. They might be able to tell you if your story is interesting as a concept, if the character stands out to them, if they would read the story themselves, or if it reminds them of other stories. Be prepared to hear some negative feedback. You want to hear this, as this is the most valuable information you could get. It will point out your blind spots and what you might need to work on more. Make sure you tell your reader to be critical and be honest. Ask them specifically what they liked, what they didn't like, what they would change, what they wouldn't change, and if there was anything that didn't make sense to them. Take notes as they speak and make sure you read them back to them so that you can make sure that you have captured their feedback accurately. Once you've got an idea of what is working well in your story and what is not, make sure that you go back and adjust major elements that need some more work. Smaller pieces of feedback you can keep in mind and adjust as you are creating the comic later. Don't feel like you've got to get it perfect at this stage. Remember, we are just getting started. At this point, there are a few different things you can do in order to advance your comic. First, it is important to acknowledge your flaws and where you might be lacking in the skill department. If you're not a writer, it might serve you well to watch some tutorials on writing scripts, stories, and dialogue. If you aren't much of an artist, make sure that you study some fundamentals like perspective, line weight, color if you're doing color, form, lighting, anatomy, etc. What is important to remember is that you don't need to be at any certain stage in order to get started. You just want to have a basic understanding of these concepts. Many comic and manga artists aren't amazing when they start, and they get better over time. You aren't any more special than they are. You will experience the exact same thing. Bonus Chapter 3.5: The Facts About Your Characters. Another thing you can do in order to get to the next stage is to write facts and details about your characters or locations. In the book, Manga and Theory in Practice by mangaka Hirohiko Araki, the guy behind JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, he outlines his process of creating character histories. This process can be long if your story has a lot of characters, so make sure you start with the most important characters first and those that show up in the story early. What Araki does is he asks himself the same questions for each of his characters and notes them down in his template. He mentions that most of this information might not ever really matter in the end, but it often defines who the character really is and how they might respond to the situations they find themselves in. They are his secret ingredient and his Bible when writing said characters. I've done this myself, and I found it to have really fleshed out characters that at first didn't really feel very three-dimensional. It made side characters vital to my main character's story and development, and contributed to the major theme of the story. Questions in this template include birthday or sign, blood type, age, eyesight, physical characteristics, education, fears, relationships, and so much more. Trust this process, and feel free to use the template I've used myself that was based on Araki's list. I left my template in the description for you to download. When you complete these descriptions, remember to reference them when you write about your characters and when you draw them. Stick to these descriptions and try not to make them do anything that contradicts these facts about them. Chapter 4, Episodic Outline. Now at this point, we've got a ton of resources for us to work off of. So, what's next? I took to writing down an episodic outline of my story. If you're doing a single chapter short story, you can skip this stage. I simply wrote out what I thought would occur in each episode until I got to the end of the section that I wanted to tell together. I made sure to outline where each episode starts and ends. Put the most weight into your first chapter. This has to hook your reader immediately and keep them reading. Even more weight should be put on the very beginning of that chapter. If your reader doesn't like the first page or first panel, they might not want to keep reading. You might not get the start and end of each chapter quite right, but again, this is just to guide us and give us an idea of what we need to include in each episode. Try to make sure that each episode provides enough context for a reader to remember where they were in the story, and for each episode to have a conflict, climax, and resolution in some form. You can interpret how intensely each of these stages needs to be defined. The resolution might simply be a twist at the end that makes your reader interested in reading the next issue. The climax is vital here, because we need to keep the reader engaged and interested, otherwise that chapter is going to be boring. It might help you to reread and edit this outline once you are finished. If it is especially long, you might find that you accidentally wrote plot holes or storylines that don't go anywhere by the end. You can fix these by adding more content, or, and this is very important, you can remove content to fix these issues. You can also feel free to share this with someone if you'd like, but this might be a bit more difficult if your story is long. My outline was initially over 20 pages long, so no one wanted to read that. If you don't get feedback on it, that's okay. Don't stop moving forward. Chapter 5, the most important step, Storyboards. Now we have an outline. Finally, I can hear you say, can we open Clip Studio and start drawing? Well, no, not quite yet, but we can start drawing a bit. This stage feels boring to beginners at first, and it might be tempting to skip it, but don't. It is vital, and once you get familiar with it, it actually becomes one of the fun stages of making comics. This stage is the storyboard. What you want to do is take the first episode from the outline we just wrote and put that down on paper in the form of simple panels, text bubbles, and basic shapes to define what our comic will look like. This is your blueprint for what you will eventually draw as your final comic. I like to do this on paper and scan it in to draw over digitally, but you can start digitally if you like. The important part is that you translate the outline into about 20 pages or however long your chapter will be, into panels that accurately tell the story in an interesting and engaging way. You can watch videos regarding what makes for interesting storyboards, or read books like these to get an idea of what sets you up for success. Keep the storyboards light and sketchy, as you don't want to spend too much time rendering these at all. Feel free to dream here. Make interesting camera angles, use speed lines, dynamic panels, and effects to tell your story better. If you're worried about drawing these things, just draw enough that you can understand what you can try to depict, and these will be future use problems to solve. Chapter 6. Making the comic. Once you have a full storyboard, we can get started on drawing. If you want to get feedback, this first storyboard is a good thing to share before you get started drawing. Now that we are sure we are done with the storyboards, we are going to bring them into Clip Studio or whatever software you prefer to create comics in. Clip Studio would be my recommendation as it has many tools built to help you create comics. I start by creating a file that will hold my comic. If you use Clip Studio, you can keep each page in the same file, but if you want to use something like Photoshop, you might have to create a file for each page. Follow the process that works best for you. At this point, there are a few stages of drawing each page will go through. These stages include paneling, initial lining, final line work, toning, effects, and lettering. Do each stage for each page first before moving on to the next stage, or you can do what I do, which is go through each stage for one page before starting on the next page. It's up to you. Assuming you're following my process, I load each storyboard into a page and place it how I want it. Then I go through each page and begin putting the panels where I want them to go. This is a fairly easy stage once you get the hang of it. Since you've already created a wonderful storyboard, you already have a good idea of where they will go. Once the paneling is out of the way, wait a minute, is it time? Do we finally get to pick up the pen? Do we really get to draw? Yes, we finally get to the beautiful stage of our initial lining. This would be something slightly above the quality of a sketch. The goal here isn't to get the cleanest lines, but to translate what we drew in the storyboards to what it might actually look like. This stage, in my opinion, is one of the most difficult and time-consuming, especially if you aren't already an amazing artist. The reason is, you'll run into challenges in accurately depicting the actions in your comic at this stage, and if you don't fix them now, you will see them in the final version. Use references for your panels at this stage, and really make sure you do your best and take the time you need to get it done right, and to the best of your ability. It is worth it. If you are exceptionally good and have a strong understanding of backgrounds and anatomy, you might be able to skip this stage for certain panels, but I wouldn't recommend you do so until you've done it for a little while. Once we've done that, we will lower the opacity of the lining and get another layer to go over it once more for our final line work. If you've been counting, we essentially draw each panel 3 times minimum, just in different forms with varying levels of effort. Focus on making clean lines with easy readability. You shouldn't be trying too hard to define your subject, as that is your initial lining stage, and you would have done that then. This final line work stage is a bit like tracing, if we're being honest, and it is just a little bit more focused and intentional, so this stage can go by very fast. Once we've completed our line work, we want to go in and tone our images. Based on your style, you might tone a lot or only a little. It is entirely up to you, but make sure you do it in some form. If you're doing your comic in color, you would follow up the toning with color. I recommend toning and then coloring, but some artists like to do them at the same time. Do what works best for you. After toning the comic, you should have a page that is essentially complete. Wow, great job. You really should be proud, and we're not even quite done. At this stage, you'll want to add any sound effects that are necessary to your page. Really think about what would help your page to include, and don't be afraid of using cheesy onomatopoeias. Those just help your reader understand better. Once we are done, we get to the final stage of lettering. We want to make sure we write out the dialogue and make it clear who is saying what. Using speech tails that point in the general direction of the speaker's mouth is the most effective and common way to do so. There are many nuances behind lettering properly, and it is just as complex as the artwork itself if you really want to get into it. If you want to learn more, I highly recommend Bad Ink Studios on YouTube, as they go over a ton of great info that I won't be able to cover in this video. Chapter 7, the last little details. Now we have a complete comic, right? Almost. There are a couple details that need to be completed, and they might be obvious to some. First is the title of your comic. Think about something that would describe the overall story of your comic and sets the tone for what your reader should expect. My comic, Kannibal, describes the nature of my main character and also defines some of the intense moments to be expected within. A description of your main character works as well. Kannibal is still one of those examples. Full Metal Alchemist is another. You can also use the character's name if it is unique enough. You can also use the name of your group or cast, the power system in your story, the name of a location, or a broad theme/conflict. Make it stand out. Make it accurate to your story and make it unique enough that it won't be confused for another story. Do a quick Google search for your title plus comic or manga before you set it in stone. Next, we want to make a cover for our comic. Reference your favorite comic or manga covers for inspiration and composition. You must have a few items in the cover in order for it to work. First, include your title, chapter number if necessary, and name. Make sure these are easy to read and have good contrast that you can read it at tiny scales or with your eyes squinted. Make the artwork in your cover significant in some way. If the story surrounds a sacred item or location, include it in your cover. If your story is more character focused, make a strong illustration of your character. Make sure you pose the character in a way that tells the viewer a lot about who they are and what to expect. Lastly, do it in color. Even if your comic is not going to be done in color, your cover must be in full color. There are rarely any successful comics or mangas that are successful and do not include some kind of color in the cover. If you're really uncomfortable with color, and I mean really uncomfortable, there are some ways around it, but I highly recommend trying color. What you can do, if you're really worried about it, is to make a monochromatic color scheme. Draw out your cover, and then go over it in shades of just one color. This is a particular style that can be interesting if you choose the right colors. This isn't exempt from the principles of color, and it can still show that you don't know what you're doing if you don't do it right. But it is easier to work with if you are new to color. Now, once you export all this together into one nice, neat file, you have finally completed your first issue. Congratulations! This is a huge achievement and the first step in a long but rewarding journey. Keep going. There is much to learn and explore, and we are all waiting to hear the amazing story you have yet to tell. Don't click off just yet though. I've got some quick tips to share that you should keep in mind on your comic making journey. Now, likely you watched this video all at once rather than paused it, came back to it after you did each one of these stages. So if this video helps you understand the process, save this video and like it so you can find it later. There's a lot of info here, so it might be helpful for you to come back and remind yourself of the next steps. Now, let's get into the quick tips. Quick general tips for any comic. First, keep your character designs fairly simple and replicable. You'll have to draw them hundreds or thousands of times. Make sure it won't be so complex that it will discourage you. Next, keep characters unique from each other. Make sure their silhouettes are strong enough that you can identify them from just that. The next tip might be a little difficult, but you might have to put down the video games in order to make this thing happen. It takes a lot of effort, but ask yourself what you value more, playing video games or sharing your story. This is a tough step to make at first, if it is an issue, but once you make your decision, stick to it, and it will be easier not to pick up the controller later. Next, learn to make backgrounds. I didn't like doing backgrounds much in the beginning, and I learned very quickly that I had to go back in and create them after the fact. Your audience wants to know where they are physically in the world, and backgrounds are vital to storytelling. Next, don't overwork yourself. Understand that it takes time to make a comic, so pace yourself and make sure you aren't setting unrealistic expectations for yourself. Be a tiny bit more lenient just to be safe. Don't look to make a perfect comic or to make perfect art. Your story won't be peak fiction. That is okay. This is your first time making comics. Your main goal should be to finish it, learn something from it, and not take shortcuts. You will serve yourself well doing this, and you will get better. The next tip, and I know I just said to put down the video games, but go do something fun every once in a while. You need to take inspiration from the world around you, and you need to do things that you enjoy. That way, you can bring that joy and energy back into your comic. You can't be the best artist you can be by being isolated to your desk and only drawing. You have to get out there, you have to enjoy yourself, and you have to have fun. Finally, celebrate your little victories. When you complete a chapter, pat yourself on the back. Give yourself a little reward, whatever it is that you do in order to celebrate little things. You've done well. When you finish a page or a panel you really like, stop for a moment and admire it. It may not be absolute perfection, but it is 100% you, so be proud. Well, Nibbling, that is about all I've got for you today. So if you enjoyed this video and you got something out of it, I'd really appreciate your likes and subscriptions to my channel. I've made this channel and Kannibal, my comic, just for you, Nibbling, so it would mean a lot to me. If you're interested in more topics like this, deep dives into some of these stages, my process, or other amazing comics and manga, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to take suggestions. Once again, thank you for watching, Nibbling.